Jody Willis. Obviously been working with Scomadi for the last 4 months really on the engineering side, trying to get to the bottom of all of the issues that we have to do with reliability, quality, and just bring the product back to how it originally was really. So I'm going to take you through the frames and just give you an idea of how we've evolved the frame over time, looking at structural parts of it as well as maybe slightly cosmetic things to make the whole fitment of the body a bit better. But primarily I'll take you through the structural parts of it. So this is our original 2018 frame. So this was an evolution from the TL frame, and it's our TT model. So in 2018 this is what it looked like. Taper roller bearings top and bottom at the time. It's pretty standard as it is there. The reason it's got this side stand is because we've actually done a modification to this, which you'll see in the next iteration, to change the side stand switch, which we were finding was a little bit unreliable. And then it has the engine bracket, which we've also modified in the subsequent models. So I'll take you through the next iteration. So 2019, this really is our current frame. This is the current production frame. And I'll take you through the modifications to it. So we've now looked at putting a thrust bearing in the bottom because we were noticing on some of the older bikes and actually some of the newer bikes that there was significant wear in that taper, in that lower taper bearing. So we've changed it to a thrust bearing, and we've formed new cups, top and bottom, purely because we were finding that in reliability terms and fitment terms, that it was much better to have a CNC cup, which gave us the reliability of fitting that bearing perfectly. So we've changed those at the moment. This is a much better quality top bearing now, and you'll see in the subsequent model that we're going to change that to a thrust bearing as well eventually. Side stand switch. It doesn't show the switch at the moment. I'll show you that on the next frame, but we've modified this to take a different type of switch, which is much more reliable. And then the engine bracket we've changed to a very similar engine bracket to the 200cc bike, which cuts out all of the vibration. So one of the criticisms of the 125 is that it's an entry-level bike really, and some of the criticisms that were coming through were to do with vibration, noise, panels vibrating, that kind of thing, and a general feel that it wasn't of the quality of a 200cc bike. So we did some research on it, we did some modifications to it, and it's essentially a very similar engine bracket to the 200cc bike, and it has eliminated all vibration. The 125 now rides like a 200cc. It's a much better experience. So that's a significant improvement on the previous frame. In order to allow us to have this thrust bearing, we've had to change the steering stop mechanism. So it's a minor one, but it's something that we did. One of the things that we found, we had a very small number of the original frames, not this frame, but the previous iteration of it, the TL frame. We had a small number of failures, and it was a cracking in the frame here, which was caused by this piece on the original frame was slightly longer, and it had some fitment holes in it, and we were finding that was a stress point, and it was actually cracking the frame. Very small number of frames, but in order to prevent that in all other iterations of this frame, we decided to extend this web and strengthen the frame significantly. We've done a lot of work on testing that. It's an extremely good and effective method of doing it. So we've done that. The reason this is a single piece like that is because all of these frames are already built. So we modified them to strengthen it. The next iteration, which is our current 2020 frame, which all brand new frames going forward will be built like this. That is one single piece. So it's very similar to the TL frame, but it's even stronger. It brings it much further round. It strengthens this whole piece a lot more than it was previously. The reason that this frame is different to the original TL is that actually it allows a much wider area here to allow for modifications and alterations on. If somebody wants to put a different engine in it, a larger engine up to maybe a 400cc engine or a motorbike engine, it will facilitate that a lot better than the original TL frame. So that was one of the reasons that it changed like that. So that's current model. Again, it's got the taper top bearing, thrust bottom bearing. We've got some examples that we can show of the thrust bearing. It's a far, far superior bearing. And then this is our model going forward. It's a step on from this, but only a minor step on, in that it will have a thrust bearing at the top and a thrust bearing at the bottom. It's almost a belt and braces approach, really. The thrust bearing is such a good bearing. It's so much better performing than the taper roller bearing, in our opinion, and what we found on all of the bikes that we've been testing. Thrust is the best. It's without a doubt the best. So this frame really is only one small step on, in that it's got a thrust bearing at the top as well as the bottom. And that's our current frame moving forward. We've got a few other things that we're doing, but they will come a little bit later, and it will be an even better frame at that point. So that's our frame evolution over the last 2 or 3 years. So we've got this is another evolution of how we've changed the steering bearings, the top and bottom steering bearings, really. So this is the original. So we had a taper roller bearing on the bottom and a taper roller bearing on the top, they're good bearings in themselves. The principle is good. You know, they have good load carrying capability. They are very good, but we found that in the application that we're using them for, it was very, very difficult to get the tolerances right and to make that bearing sit in its perfect position. And we were finding that we were getting some wear, and sometimes on the longer term bikes, that wear was quite significant. So we looked to change it. So our next iteration of the frame and fork assembly, it introduced these cups. So they're CNC machined cups to a very good tolerance. The bearings fit in them perfectly, much better than just sitting in a formed tube. And we changed the bottom bearing to thrust bearing. This thrust bearing, it's self-aligning, so it has the ability to take up any discrepancy in the alignment of the forks. One of the problems we were finding with the taper roller bearing is that in order to get them running perfectly, you have to have an absolutely perpendicular and perfectly concentric fork and head tube, which simply doesn't happen. So we introduced this thrust bearing, which is self-aligning. It has difficult to take apart, but it has a ring on the bottom and a dish that sits in it, and that will take up any misalignment. And the difference is dramatic. You can feel it just from the point of view of how it runs as a thrust bearing versus a taper bearing. So at the moment we retained the taper roller bearing at the top, purely because we have a whole stock of frames and forks that we need to use up, and we couldn't accommodate thrust with the current frame forks. The next iteration of it allows us to alter the forks so that we can accommodate a thrust bearing at the top as well. So this for us is the optimum situation. It's fantastic. We've tested it, we've done some long-term mileage tests on the bikes. Zero wear, absolutely zero wear. So they're dramatically different to the taper.
By the time we get bikes in the UK, eventually
they will have thrust. Yeah, most definitely. That's what we're working towards at the moment. And then the other thing that we've done, previously we had a fairly rudimentary method of sealing these bearings. It was just a rubber washer. We've now introduced what's called a washer seal, which it's commonplace on motorbikes. It's a metal washer, but it has a rubber outer, and this isn't the correct size, but it fits perfectly on top of the bearing on both top and bottom, and it seals it perfectly. So it's a much better solution. That's our bearing evolution. Fits with the frames as well. That's how it's gone.